You could be making your garden work a lot harder than it has to be. So let me show you about companion planting and how it can boost your harvest as well as take care of your plants naturally. A lot of times when people are talking about companion planting, they're talking about using plants to help deter pests. That's probably one of the most common ways of doing companion planting as it relates to pests. It's not my favorite. Believe it or not, I don't find it to be as effective as some of the other ways I'm going to show you today. And also there are other ways to companion plant besides just managing pests, but we're going to talk about those a little bit later. Now, if you do want to focus on deterring pests, one of your best plants is going to be something like onions, garlics, leeks. These are in the allium family and they all kind of have like a really strong scent, and that scent is supposed to deter pests. Now, I've never really found any pests crawling on my onions or garlic. It's not that it's not possible, but I have found pests that grow on plants right next to my onions. So right here I have some celery, and my celery has a little bit of bites in it. I'm guessing that there is some worms or possibly, you know, some little aphids on here that's chewing it up. Now, mind you, it's not chewing it up badly. It's very, very minuscule. It's very, very small. And I think that that's in part to these green onions sitting right here. The green onions, the scent of it masks the scent of the celery so that the pests are less likely to go near it. It also kind of deters pests that have sensitivity to the smell of this allium family. But it works really well when the plant kind of stays the same size. So with the celery, it kind of works out because the celery and the green onions are about the same height. But I put these green onions underneath some tomatoes one year, and they did great while the tomatoes were young. But once the tomatoes surpassed in height the onions, it was really pretty useless. The bugs stayed kind of up above where the onions were, and so it wasn't as effective as I was hoping. Now, there are some other plants that help deter. So if you have a problem with root knot nematodes, you might want to try marigolds, specifically like the tangerine marigolds, and then also mustard. Mustard greens helps repel root knot nematodes. And there's other examples of like herbs like dill, where you can plant dill amongst your brassicas, like your cabbages and your broccolis, your cauliflowers, your kohlrabis, your kales, and it deters the cabbage moth that damages the center of a cabbage. So those are all great ideas, and you know, as long as you really take into account like the height and how you're interplanting them. So really what should be happening to this celery to get the most effectiveness out of deterring pests with this green onion is to wrap the celery in green onions. Or if you had a brassica plant like a broccoli, it's to wrap that broccoli plant with dill pretty much all around it. It's a lot more planting than I think most people think. Putting one plant is really not going to deter it. In fact, putting an entire hedge around this of a companion plant still might not deter them all. It is better though. It is definitely better than absolutely nothing. A companion plant pest control method that I think works a little bit better than deterring, like with the green onions, is something like this, which is attracting. It sounds kind of backwards, but you're going to attract a different kind of pest. You're going to attract predatory insects. So right here I have a borage, and down here growing like a little mat underneath my tomatoes is bee balm. And so both of these attract certain kinds of insects to it, specifically pollinator style, predatory style insects. So you're going to get a lot of, number one, pollinators that are going to help with pollinating some of the tomato plants, but you're also going to bring in things like wasps, parasitic wasps, lacewings, even ladybugs will really kind of crawl all over the borage. But these plants right here, you can put them kind of tucked underneath your plants, especially these fruiting plants that have a lot of flowering, and they are going to bring in those predators. And here is why that's really good. Yes, it's asking more bugs to come into your garden, but the more predators that you can attract, the more that they're going to eat the bad bugs. If they are in your garden eating the bad bugs, you don't have to treat. This is actually what I do in my garden. I rarely treat any plants, and I certainly don't do any widespread treatment of my garden. I'm thinking about it this year as to whether or not to treat pickle worms, because last year I had a lot of good progress with not treating the pickle worms because I had enough birds in my area. I've created kind of a sanctuary for birds to come here, and I've given them something to eat, which is the pickle worms, which they seem to really like. That and the tomato hornworm, they really enjoyed those. So if I don't treat, then I'm going to have a food source for the birds, and then the more birds will hang around. The same kind of happens with these predatory insects. The more kind of bad pests you have, and the more like pollen that you give them and bad pests that you give them, and like safe places to live in terms of like creating little structures for them, the more likely that they're going to stay here and hang out and eat your bad bugs, as well as have their little babies and create their next life cycle. And then those life cycles and those children and grandchildren and so on end up staying in your garden because you've given them a safe place with lots of food. So attracting the predator insects will keep balance in your garden instead of you having to like go out here and manage it yourself. I hate picking off bugs. I don't like spraying anything because it does disrupt that natural balance that's occurring. And honestly, I just don't want to have to deal with it. Like, that's my least favorite part of gardening, is dealing with pests. So by taking a completely hands-off approach and instead planting some plants that predators like, as well as like giving them a space to live here, you know, like underneath the foliage, or creating some wood structures and things like that to give them a home, entices them, and then they work for you. It's an awesome relationship, and it keeps the natural balance without you having to be involved. Bee balm and borage are some of my favorites, but you can also do cilantro, dill, and a lot of other herbs. There are many herbs that good predatory pests love. So honestly, if you can just pick up any herbs, whether they are annuals or perennials, and get them in your garden, that's really going to help. The next one on our list that's a really good companion plant is this guy right here. This is chamomile. It's a little baby right now. It's going to get a lot bigger. It's going to have those cute little white flowers, and I use it as medicinal. But it's a really great companion plant, but not for the reason that you think. And this is the third type of companion plants, and by far one of my favorite ways of doing companion planting, and that is trap crop. So a trap crop is a plant that you specifically plant. Maybe you have another use, like I'm going to keep the flowers, but for the most part, it is designed strictly to attract the bad bugs. So we talked about attracting the predatory insects. Now we're talking about attracting the bad bugs. And you're like, why would we want to do that? Well, the bad bugs need a place to go in your garden. They really do. If you really want to have that balance that we talked about earlier, you do have to have a place for them, because if you eliminate them completely, the predator bugs have no reason to be in your garden, and no reason to try to keep the balance, no reason to make babies there, and no reason to make a home if they don't have something to eat. So you do have to give them something to eat. So what I like to do is use a plant like this, like chamomile, that I can still harvest the flowers and use it medicinally, but at the same time, this plant loves aphids, and aphids loves this plant. The aphids don't really tend to bother the chamomile. Even if it gets completely infested, it still has always produced flowers for me. Some other examples are going to be things like radishes. We don't eat the leaves of the radish, but it really like attracts different kinds of like beetles and slugs and snails and different kinds of caterpillars or worms and things like that. The leafy green of a radish does that, and does it quite well. But we don't eat the greens anyway, so who cares, right? I mean, some of us eat the greens of radishes. Sorry about that. You can eat the greens, but if you're more interested in eating the root of it, or maybe you have a few radishes that went too far and they're too big, and instead of pulling them, leave them in the garden and let the pests come to that plant. I know that some people are concerned that if you put a trap crop, you're attracting bugs into the garden, and that trap crop won't keep them on the trap crop. But that's not actually what happens. If they find a plant that they love, they're going to migrate there. And it's not like they're going to go to that plant and then go, hey, I've had enough, I'm going to go to this tomato right next to it. That's not really how it works. They go to that plant and they will stay on that plant until that plant withers away and completely dies. And it takes quite a while. I mean, that plant's going to look awful. It's gonna look terrible. I have one I'm gonna show you, and it looks really, really bad, but the plant is still alive, and so as long as it's still alive, those bad pests wanna stay on it. But once it really starts to die out, they are gonna migrate and find another plant. So at that point, you wanna remove the trap crop. And when you remove it, you need to kind of isolate it. So that could mean going over to your burn pile, tossing it in your burn pile, and starting a fire immediately to kill off all of those pests. Another option, if you don't have the ability to burn, like I don't have the ability to burn here in the neighborhood that I live in, it's not allowed. So what I have to do is I have to take that whole plant and throw it away in the garbage, basically. I have to seal it up into a plastic bag and then put that out in the trash. Now you could put it in your compost, but once again, when you put it in your compost, some of those are gonna become food for the other bugs, and some of them are actually gonna migrate out of your compost pile and probably move back into your garden. So just keep that in mind. Maybe if your compost pile is far enough away from your garden, that could be a viable option. Maybe if you bury it good and deep inside of your compost pile, that's an option as well. Me personally, I really lean towards burn it or trash it. Those are the two options for me. Let's talk about some of the plants that are perfect for trap cropping. So besides chamomile and radishes like we talked about, nasturtiums are a really good one. And nasturtiums have such beautiful flowers. They bring in pollinators. There's so many good things about nasturtium. They're edible, medicinal, like so many. And they're a perfect trap crop. And they get really big and bushy, and they seem to outgrow the damage that these pests make to it. Another one is going to be like a blue Hubbard squash. If you've been having problems with squash vine borers or squash bugs, if you plant your blue Hubbard a little bit away from the rest of your crop, they are going to love that blue Hubbard squash. I don't know what it is about that particular variety that they absolutely adore, but it's really going to pull them over there. So if you sacrifice that one blue Hubbard squash that's set away from the rest of your garden or a few beds down from your main crop, you're going to have a better success rate when it comes to those types of pests. And the one that I like to use during the summer the most is going to be sunflowers. I feel like sunflowers attract like pretty much every single pest that are out there. When I started growing sunflowers, I started seeing pests that I've never seen before. So it was almost like I was attracting even more bugs. But there is a positive there. I was attracting more bad bugs, but it was also attracting like a huge amount of like good bugs. I still don't know what some of them are. Like I'm fairly certain they're good bugs because they seem like they're predatory in nature. They don't chew the leaves of the plant. They seem like they're hunting for something. That's usually the way to tell a good bug from a bad bug is the good bug damaging the plant. If you don't see it chewing on the leaves or making holes or anything like that, or trying to pierce the tomatoes or something like that, it's probably a predatory insect because they are looking for other bugs to eat. They just happen to be crawling on, you know, the plant that those bugs hang out on. Well, sunflowers very much attracted so many terrible pests, like stuff that I have never seen, types of beetles and stuff that I've never even seen in my garden until I started planting sunflowers. But man, did it bring in an incredible amount of pollinators, an incredible amount of predatory bugs, that now I grow them every single year just to kind of bring in more of that to create more balance. And of course, sunflowers are beautiful and they grow so well during our summers here in hot, hot, sunny Florida. So they are a great plant to use as a trap crop, especially during the hottest part of our summers where we have the highest amount of pests. So we've talked a lot about pests when it comes to companion planting because I think that's what a lot of people use companion plants for, but there's actually a few more reasons. And one of those reasons is nutrients. And so we're sitting in front of my bean bed. This is a bed of dry beans. I think there's like 4 different kinds in here. There's like cranberry bean, I think there's like a little red bean, a kidney bean, a cannelloni bean. There's so many in here. I just kind of tossed whatever I had. Now you could plant these underneath really nitrogen heavy plants like your greens, or even your garlics or your onions, maybe even your corn. In fact, that's actually one of the most well-known companion planting mixes, which was the Three Sisters planting, which kind of originated, I believe, down here in Florida, I think. The Three Sisters is corn, squash, and beans. So the corn, which we're going to talk about later, gave the plants, the bean plants, something to climb. The squash covered the soil around the corn and the beans to create a weed-free environment for one, as well as like shading out the roots of the plant so that way they stayed cooler. And then the beans fed nitrogen to the corn and the squash. Isn't that the coolest thing? So that's what these guys do. They fix nitrogen in the soil. Legumes in general, peas, beans, cowpeas, there's some plants like sun hemp and such that live in the legume family. They're nitrogen fixing plants. So what they do is they go down into the roots and use bacteria that then helps them convert, and then they push nitrogen out through their roots, as well as like there's nitrogen in their leaves and such. So once they've done producing and everything, and you take your harvest, you can chop this down and just leave it right in your beds, and it will continue to feed the soil. But while they're planted, they feed the soil as well. Now, I will say this, I have grown these around plants and absolutely not used any fertilizer whatsoever, and the plants do survive and live. But if you want larger harvest, you are still going to have to, give some nutrients, whether that's amendments or fertilizers or anything like that. I have a video that I just did on everything you ever wanted to know about amendments and fertilizers, so I'm going to put that at the end of this video, so make sure to check that out. So it's not necessarily a complete replacement, but it definitely is a really good amendment. And this is a way of doing it where you're cover cropping an area that you want to have more nitrogen in, but you can also plant these beans like bush beans, maybe even vining beans underneath your tomato plants, because then they'll crawl up the stakes that the tomato plants already have. Or you can put them near your corn or your sunflowers and they'll crawl up the corns and the sunflowers. It's really, really cool. But they help with nitrogen. Another one that's a little less well known is going to be borage. Borage helps with phosphorus, believe it or not. So if you have lower phosphorus levels in your garden, you can plant a patch of borage underneath your other plants as a companion, especially for fruiting plants that really like phosphorus, like your tomatoes, your peppers, eggplants, squashes, all of those that create, a fruit with seeds inside, and it will help provide that phosphorus for that plant. Once again, a cover crop is really going to help the soil in general, but planting these plants underneath the other plants are also going to help feed those plants. So it's kind of a cool way of companion planting. So we've gave a lot of love to our vegetables, but let's talk about our fruits. I'm sitting underneath my peach tree right now, and I am growing some plants underneath my peach tree. I actually grow plants underneath all of my fruit trees. Usually they're annuals, although I'm gonna think about getting into some perennials. I have been growing tangerine marigolds underneath my peach tree for as long as I can remember. I save the seeds every single year from this patch and I just put them down. The minute I see these guys starting to flower, oh, I already got peaches. But the minute I see them start to flower is what kind of tells me, hey, you need to put your marigolds underneath your peach tree. And so I have one plant that kind of started from some volunteers, but I have a bunch of tiny ones that are starting that should grow very beautifully through the summer. So what this does is a couple of things. One, it keeps the base of this plant shaded, because once this is completely full in, it's like a blanket over top of it, so it keeps it cold during the winter and it keeps it cooler during the summer. I know that sounds weird. If you cover it, how is it keeping it cooler? Well, the ground is actually cooler than the outside temperature, so the ground, if you put a plant on top of it, it's going to insulate it and it's going to keep some of that cooler air at the roots of this tree. The other thing that marigolds help with is root knot nematodes, and since we grow a lot of our fruit trees directly in our sand, we generally don't grow them in raised beds or in rich soil. You're really trying to teach them to grow in our native sand here, and our native sand has root knot nematodes in it. I mean, quite a bit, and it can kill a mature tree. So the way that I get around that is I plant a bed of marigolds underneath my fruit trees. And I do a lot of different ones. I do nasturtiums, I do marigolds, I do snapdragons, I do all different kinds depending on the fruit tree and whether or not it's resistant to nematodes naturally or it's not. So this peach tree is not resistant to them, although the rootstock has been designed for growing in Florida. So they have taken some of those things in consideration, but as an added protection and to cover the ground and make it pretty out here, I'm growing the tangerine marigolds, and these tangerine marigolds help with the root knot nematodes and keeping that soil nice and cool like we talked about. The other cool thing is you only need to buy seeds once for these because once you put the marigolds down, if you want, you don't even have to collect the seeds. You could just chop the plant and leave it right here. It'll create mulch. and feed the peach tree, and it will also reseed itself. So some of these little ones that are popping up here are reseeded from last year's marigolds, because I do chop them and drop them right in here. And some of them are the ones that I put down because I hadn't seen a lot of sprouts yet. So this is a really easy, fun, beautiful way of companion planting. Now, I think a lot of people also look at companion planting as in, I want to make sure that I'm not putting two plants together that shouldn't be together. I see this talked a lot about, that two plants can hinder another plant. There is some scientific evidence that does show that certain plants can disrupt each other. So when you think of something like tomatoes and potatoes, you generally don't want to put those together. A lot of the times when they're in like the same family or a close family, they tend not to do well together because they tend to attract the same like diseases and pests. That's why you kind of want to separate them. That's why monoculture or just like planting a whole bed with nothing but one thing in it isn't always the best idea. Polyculture, or planting lots of things intermingled together, is a better way of handling it. There are so many combinations of plants that shouldn't be together that you need like a degree to like learn them all and figure them all out. I feel like it's way too complicated for the average backyard gardener. Hell, it's too complicated for me. I don't want to do all that research. So the way that I kind of get around that is I make sure that I plant different plants together. So I'll have green onions mixed with celery, mixed with peppers. Or then I'll have beans mixed with borage, mixed with tomatoes. Like, I just kind of pick 3 plants and I plant them together. So if you accidentally pick 2 plants that shouldn't be together, like maybe you mix some potatoes with some tomatoes, but then you mixed in some garlic as well, you are creating some separation amongst those 2 plants that don't like to be together by putting in garlic, a companion plant that's going to help with some of the pests. So I feel like that has always worked in my garden, to where I don't really ever have to worry about planting 2 plants together that maybe don't like each other. Now, there is one exception. The one exception is going to be something like a sunflower. A sunflower, and there's a few other like flowers that live in this world, create like a chemical substance out of their roots that basically kill off anything in the vicinity. It's part of like their defense mechanism. There's not very many plants like that. There's only a handful, and sunflowers happen to be one of them. And I think that it's a little exaggerated out in the world when they tell you, like, don't plant anything near a sunflower. Sunflower's going to kill it. Really, the radius of what it kills is generally like right at the base of the plant. I've never seen it kill anything more than 12 inches from its base. So if you had like a 12-inch square, it's, you know, kind of killing the stuff right underneath it. But as long as you pick plants to go with the sunflower that can be planted 12 inches away and get bushy, a lot of the times you can't even tell that the sunflower is actually disturbing or creating, you know, a kill zone in your garden, because I usually pick like bushier plants to plant near the sunflowers. And so when they get, even though they might be 2 feet away, they're getting bushy enough that you can't see the ground around the sunflower because they're so bushy, but their stem or their root is still like 2 feet away. That's the way to do it, really. Like sweet potatoes is a really great example. I grow sunflowers in the midst of my sweet potato beds, which is, I'm told, a huge no-no. It's always worked for me. I've never had a problem. As long as I don't plant my actual sweet potato slip within 12 inches of that sunflower, it's been fine. So sunflowers are kind of like the only one that sit on my list of just being careful about what I plant them with other plants, because it can, you know, they're doing this defense mechanism to try to give themselves the best chances at life. I know there's a lot of ways out there to do companion planting, and there's a lot of different goals that somebody might have for companion planting. I hope this video has helped. If it has, head down in the comments and tell me something new that you learned. I would love to also hear your feedback on your favorite companion plants. Happy gardening, guys.